All right, hey, welcome. Thanks to everybody who has logged in. We hope that you logged in successfully, no troubles. Probably for all of us, we're all so used to Zoom at this point that it's second nature, for better or for worse, right? We're gonna go ahead and get started. My name is Mike Cosper. I'm a pastor here at Sojourn East, and I'd love to welcome all of you to this second live event we've hosted on soul care issues. Tonight's topic is grief, loss, and a gradual resurrection. It's going to be a panel discussion and some short talks on the subject of grief. I come into this pretty keenly interested, frankly, because of my own journey of loss. I lost a dear friend just about a week and a half ago, and he was memorialized this morning at the church where he served. And so I'm eager to be here. I'm eager to learn. Before I bring up our moderator, I want to cover just a couple of items. The first is that this is a Q&A event. So whenever you have questions throughout the evening, just type them into the Q&A interface there on Zoom, and they'll be queued up for our panel who is going to do their best to answer them all. Also, this presentation will be recorded and posted on Sojourn East's YouTube channel, which is in the same place you find our Sunday sermon these days. So if you missed our first event, you'll find it there. It's called Your Faith and Your Emotions in a Time of Crisis. And then this one will be up there shortly. So let's just take a moment. Let's just take a moment and say a word of prayer, and then let me introduce you to Eric. Father, in your mercy, we come to you as people who are familiar with grief, approaching a God who's familiar with grief. We come to learn, we come to better enter into our own grief as we hear stories and hear from the scriptures, and hear the many ways that you have reached out and transformed lives in the midst of hardship and sorrow. It's a broken world, Lord, and it's not the way it's supposed to be. But somehow in the midst of that, Lord, you reach out and you reach us. So we come tonight with eager ears and broken hearts and a readiness to draw close to you. So may that happen in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so let me introduce our moderator for the evening. This can be Dr. Eric Johnson. Eric is the director of the Gideon Institute of Christian Psychology and Counseling at the Houston Baptist University. He also founded the Institute for Christian Psychology here in Louisville. He serves Sojourn East as the Director of Lay Counseling. Eric, thank you for taking this role tonight, for moderating with us, and we're eager to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Mike. It's wonderful to be here tonight. This is such a great opportunity for us to talk together and to hear from you. We hope that many of you will be asking questions, so this will be the best kind of a dialogue we can manage under these strange circumstances that we're in. But as you'll recall, some of you were able to hear the talk on emotion a month ago, and this is a continuation of a theme of kind of exploring what it is that we're going through and how we can go through it in a way that glorifies the Lord and enhances our lives and enables us to flourish more according to the way that that delights him. And these are hard times. This is a time of tremendous, really, the word unprecedented is being used so much, unprecedented loss in our culture. I think I've read that over 30 million jobs in the US have been lost, at least temporarily. And companies are going bankrupt. We know that this is devastating many lives and relationships across our culture. And the church can't be immune from this because we're mortals, we're humans, we're sinners as well. And so this is an important opportunity for us to explore these issues in a way that brings us closer to the Lord. So thank you for joining us here. We're aware that there are folks around the world that are participating with us, and we welcome you as well. So we got a great a group of people to talk with and to hear from today. I'm just so happy for James and Terra Santos. They will be with us speaking. Fred Hampton will also be speaking, and then we'll be joined by Briahna Michalsky. So thank you to our panelists for being willing to share some of your story and some of your experiences with grief and loss. Loss is inevitable in this life, and as I said, we're going through a lot right now. But the question that we're really going to be exploring, I think, is how grief can be avoided and yet has to be brought into our lives in a sort of intentional way in order for us to really process our loss properly. And we want to talk about what that looks like. And to help us get started, we're going to ask James Santos to speak and share some teaching about this subject. He's done a lot of work in this area, and I know him as a friend, as a co-group participant for a long time. We've shared a lot of our story together. He was one of the founding pastors of Sojourn East, and he has had some extraordinary experiences working in hospice for a number of years, and now for being a business chaplain. And so, James, I just welcome you here and look forward to hearing from you tonight.
Thanks, Eric, and good evening, friends. I know it's good to have this space and to join you. You know, one of the things that I know that even in stepping into this space, it takes a lot of courage, doesn't it, to be able to consider grief and loss. And so, you know, my heart is that this time would be a time where we can help each other undo aloneness, because I think a big part of grief is feeling isolated and alone, and not being able to even know what we're grieving about. And so what might have interested you even this evening is that you are going through your own grief. But second, it may be that you are desiring to help someone in your life currently that is going through grief. And I pray that this time together would be helpful to you. And my prayer is very specific, because I think in Scripture and Christ's presence, that Christ would meet you and me in whatever grief or loss that we're facing, including myself, my wife, you know, Terra, and our family. Whatever grief that you're sensing, that you're feeling, that you're imagining, and seeing come out even your relationships. You know, I think grief and loss is really an invitation to slow down and make space for inward healing, transformation, and deepening. And so this is a space where we can actually just take a deep breath. I even find myself with my heart even just racing right now, and to be able to just take a deep breath, right, and to consider a topic as grief. And so I pray that we can ask the Lord to help us, and that Jesus would help us show up and be known in the midst of our sorrow, and that you would feel hope, peace, you know, through this. So what is grief? I know we've tossed that word around already. In its basic way of describing it, grief is this felt sense of loss of any kind. It could be the loss of a loved one, or a job, or a dream, a hope, a relationship, and especially even during this time, this pandemic season, it's the loss of the world we once knew, right? The loss of the norm we once knew, the routines, the structure, the rhythms. Many people are still trying to grasp what the new norm is. It's also anticipatory grief, right? It's anticipating even grief in the future. I mean, even my wife and I are already discussing what will the new school year look like, or what will family vacations look like. There's anticipatory grief. And so how to talk about grief is really tough. And so maybe to, again, just bring this to ourselves right now, presently in this present moment, can you name specifically your grief at this moment? I may even just pause here. What is a grief or a loss that maybe your mind has been lingering on, these past couple of days? Can you name that loss right now? Take a moment. Even if you're taking notes, maybe you just jot that down on your journal. Maybe even noticing it in your body, right? Where do you feel that loss? Where do you feel that grief? Do you feel it in your chest? Do you feel it on your shoulders, your head, your stomach, your arms, your hands? Just to be able to name it. Or if you can't name it, can you describe it? Can you describe even the story that you're coming up in your mind right now, as I invite you to even consider this question? I think it's important, even right now, to be able just to take notice and be aware what you're grieving and what's your loss. Jesus had an encounter with Mary in John chapter 20, verses 15 and 16. I want to read this to you, and I want you to just take this in, because Jesus was a man of sorrows who was acquainted with grief. And this is one of those accounts in John's Gospels where we see Jesus facing grief for what it is. And I just want you to listen to these words and to take this in your heart, in your soul, even right now as I read this, these two verses from John 20. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, you have carried him away. Tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Let me just repeat what Jesus said. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" So the first thing I just want us to just observe just from that account is that Jesus acknowledges and bears witness to Mary's tears. So if you notice, Jesus does not judge or critique or hurry Mary along through her tears and say to her, "Hey, come on, Mary, it's a Resurrection Sunday, right? Cheer up." No, Jesus asks Mary a question and gently pursues Mary with questions. It's really an act of love and just genuine connection in Jesus's heart. And this is one of the first points that I want to make in helping us with grief. Our griefs, friends, need to be witnessed. And if there is one that witnesses our grief, it's Jesus himself. But we also need the company of safe friends, of people to be able to witness our grief, because our grief is unique. Something also that is another observation from these two verses in John 20 is that Jesus affirms Mary's loss as unique. And this is the point, friends, that I want to make about grief. Our loss, friends, is always our worst loss. We cannot compare our loss to the next person. As much as I think we're tempted and catapulted to see how other people are grieving, our grief is very unique. And Jesus affirmed and noticed Mary's talk and tears. Jesus said to her, "Mary." And so when Jesus draws near to our grief, it's always personal. It's Jesus saying James or Tara or Eric or Fred, right? It's that specific and that unique. We've probably heard the saying, time, heals all wounds. And what I've discovered is that there's nothing really about time that heals all wounds. It's what you do with your talk and what you do with your tears, expressed in prayer and in the witness of safe friends, that you'll see wounds heal over time. And so I think the invitation when considering our own grief, even as we're feeling it right now, as you're hearing my voice, as I'm staring at the green light where my camera is located on my camera, I want you to know that you're not alone in your grief. It's an invitation to slow down, to take notice, to hold space, and to say that we're alone because Jesus sees our grief and affirms it, acknowledges it, bears witness to it. I was going to invite my wife to share just a little bit about her heart dealing with grief a little bit from our story and from her story. And so just wanted to allow you to hear my wife here.
Yeah, so one of the things that James and I have had many conversations about over the years is the way different people process grief and how that just looks so different from person to person, because we don't tend to think we should all look alike, right? Like we don't tend to think we should all have the same hair color, skin color, height, right? You know, like we have a million differences about our bodies, our physical appearance, but for some reason, sometimes we still have this expectation that we should all process things the exact same way, and we don't. That's just not the reality. And so one of the things that he and I have talked a lot about is just that, because the way I process grief and the way my husband processes grief looks very different a lot of the times. And so I want to touch on just a couple of the things he mentioned in the talk already and add to that a little bit. So one of the things he mentioned is not comparing our grief to others. And I think this also goes in with grief shaming, how we can possibly feel like if somebody else isn't feeling grief as strongly as I am, or maybe they're not as tearful as I am, or they don't seem as upset as I am, then they must not be really grieving, or it must not have been a big deal to them, or something like that. And that's just not the case. But we have this natural kind of tendency sometimes to judge and compare the way that we interact with grief and how somebody else is interacting with grief. And so like for me, for example, I tend to have a lot of emotions on the inside, but they don't come up really naturally. I have to really work to allow my emotions to come up and to be present, and not to try to stuff them down, not to try to ignore them, because that's honestly what I want to do half the time. And it's always going to come out, because grief is going to come out, whether we want it to come out or not. Eventually it will, especially if we're trying to stuff it down and pretend it doesn't exist. And so, you know, for me, it might look like having to have time alone first to be able to process, manage, and see my grief before I'm ready and willing to share it with someone else. Or what it might also mean is what it looked like a little over a year ago, me paying a therapist, which we're going to hear from some, me going and seeing a therapist who knows what to do to help gently pull that out of me if I don't know how to access it. And so, you know, just even acknowledging how different people have different time frames for their grief. One person, you know, they really may grieve in a seemingly fast way, and another person may grieve in what seems like they just won't ever stop grieving, right? And it just looks so different. So, you know, just back to the comparing thing and realizing how different that can be. And also just noticing within ourselves that our history, whether we have a history of trauma in our backgrounds or our family of origin, like all of those things are going to make a difference and an impact in the way that we process grief. If you had a parent that told you every time when you were a child, stop crying, like strong people don't cry, or, you know, to the boys, real men don't cry, you know, that's going to impact you, and you're going to grow up and you're going to have some of these beliefs. And so just notice that it doesn't mean something's wrong with you necessarily because you feel like, oh, I just can't cry. Chances are there's a reason you're feeling that to begin with. So just notice it. And, you know, one of the things I've had to really work really hard on myself is being able to notice something without judging it. So when I'm having a feeling or an emotion that I don't understand, if I'm grieving the loss of something that I don't understand, not judging whether it's a right or wrong thought, opinion, emotion, etc., because that's another thing that I have a tendency to do is just that. And so, you know, it's just, I'm trying to see where to go here. So just acknowledging that whatever's coming up within us, be aware of it. Whatever that thing may be aware of it. And, you know, lastly, and one last thing I want to say is, even if we think about the way that we can respond to, you know, difficult situations or threats, you know, you think about fight, flight, or freeze, we can still initiate some of those same things when we're going through grief. You know, one person might be experiencing grief and all you see on the outside is anger. So it doesn't look to you like they're grieving. They look like a really angry person, but that there's really a lot of grief underlying that. Another person may be trying to get as far away from the grief as humanly possible because they don't know how to be with it in a way that won't overtake them. And someone else might totally freeze and numb out and blank and kind of, you don't even think they're feeling anything, right? Like anywhere in their body, because we just have these different ways of processing. So I guess, one of the big things, James has been in the grief area for a long time. And that's when we just go back and forth with just acknowledging, like, it looks different for different people. It looks different in our marriage. It looks different. We have 5 children. And I could say we probably have 5 very different ways of processing grief in the midst of all this. So.
Yeah. And so, just to summarize, even what we have been sharing, I think when dealing with grief, you can't speed it up. You can't fast forward it. You can only notice, but slow down. So one of the things that I always encourage people is slow down. Slow down so that you can affirm what you are noticing. And then it also invites you to explore, but also to reflect. And so when considering grief, and just even what scripture says, one of the neat verses that I go to, and it was one of the verses I went to a lot when I was, in hospice, is Revelation chapter 21, verse 4. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither there shall be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. I mean, that's the promise. That's the hope. But on our journey to that hope and to that place that God will once and for all give to us in a new heavens and new earth, I think we're going to weep our way towards that. And so we need to acknowledge and also give space to these tears, because Jesus does. And so that's my prayer, even in this talk, that it's not just information just to give you, but to be able to do this in community. But also prayer, that I would encourage us. One of the regular things that I encourage people when dealing with their grief is how do we pray our grief, our pain to the Lord, because He listens. And so, friends, take heart during this time as we're going through this together, and to know that you are not alone. That's the reason why we're doing these things, to undo aloneness in each other. So this is much as a blessing, but also a resource for me. So I'm glad that you tuned in. Thank you.
Thanks, James and Terra. That was really helpful reminder that we're unique individuals and we all have our own stories and our own experiences of grief. I think you made it okay for us to be who we are and to deal with grief in our own way. And we really needed that reminder. That's how God views us, and He accepts us as we are. And it does lead to a couple of questions. If there is this broad space of grieving uniquely as we are, and granting freedom and grace to one another in the midst of all of that, is there? I'd like to talk about the extremes a little bit. Is there too much grief? What does the excess look like? And then I'm going to follow it up with what do we do with when there's not any grief?
Yeah. And I think, Eric, that's where community is so important, right? Because I think if you don't have a safe community, or let's say, a therapist or someone, a pastor, pastoral counselor, yes, if you can get stuck. I think that's where a lot of unresolved and complex grief happen, is that they get stuck in that cycle and they fall into this victim mentality. And I think that's one of the things when I was a hospice chaplain, I really made sure is to evaluate their community, the relationships around them, because you're right. I think people can go way to the extreme and isolate more and find themselves stuck. So I think finding safe community individuals that you can can guide you, right? If you are stuck, they can speak into that, because I think that's important, because a lot of people I've counseled, obviously, and cared for have experienced that.
So then the corollary is what happens when we're stuck in the opposite way. You both of you touched on that a little bit, but it's a common problem, I think, when we kind of almost feel like maybe we're beyond grief, or maybe we're so spiritual that we're not feeling grief, but yet that may indicate the opposite kind of challenge.
Yeah, well, and that's where we have to be very careful with, I think we've heard the phrase spiritual bypassing, right? Or just, Christianizing, or, blessing, there's a spiritualizing of our grief. And I think there's something where, again, I'm going back to community here to help out and discern that, because sometimes a person who studies the Bible and scriptures can't particularly detect that. And, there's actually a story, Eric, where I was meeting with a friend, I think it was in Panera Bread, and he noticed right away how quickly I made it spiritual when he was sensing within me that there was sadness. And he was courageous and loving enough and say, James, I sense some sadness in you. Like, I wonder what that is. I mean, I hear what you're quoting in the Psalms, but man, I just sense there's a sadness. And when he said that, Eric, I mean, I've totally found myself like, wow, yeah, I think you're right. There is still some sadness, because I can sometimes get in my words or in my head, if you will, but it took the safety of a good friend to notice that. So again, I'm going back to relationships to be of help in that once again.
Thanks. That's really helpful from both of you. All right. Well, we're going to turn next to hear from another one of our friends at Sojourn East, Fred Hampton. And Fred is a personal friend of mine, but he's also been a therapist for 30 years. He's a licensed clinical social worker, and has his own story of grief that I believe he's going to share with us. So, Fred, would you tell us some of what you've been through?
Thank you, Eric. Love you, brother. It's good to be here this evening. As Eric said, I've been a therapist for over 30 years, and much of what I've attempted to do is invite people into their grief. It's a lot of what therapy is, chipping away at the denial and inviting the grieving process. Most of us, I think, have rolled into our adult lives with some measure of denial about our grief. And a failure to grieve, I think, in reality, limits what we can know about ourselves. And a failure to grieve has impact on how well we love, how intimate we are with the people in our lives. So what I've attempted to do is walk beside people and encourage them to unpack their stories. And again, I believe that we all carry some emotional and spiritual wounding into our adult lives. I'm reminded of the words of a Christian author, John Elders, which many of you may be familiar with. He writes, and I'm quoting him, "We are called to a place where a deeper work in our heart is called for, if we are to be able to continue our spiritual journey. It is in the desert experience of the heart where we are stripped of the protective clothing of the role we have played. Healing, repentance, and faith are called for in ways we have not known previously. At this place in our journey, we face a wide and deep chasm that refuses us passage through self-effort. In this place, that truth eradicates the final heart walls from the experience of surrender." And he's speaking about the value of vulnerability, the value of exposure, of feeling and of need, and exposure of the wound that we carry and the grief that needs to come along with it. I believe that our righteous work is to give voice to our wound and to remove the shame and confront the lies that we all carry. God's invitation is to live in the truth of his love and his grace. This grace becomes a crucible where mercy will abound. Life is hard. I think we all can probably agree to that. And this season we're in is particularly hard in many ways. We're frightened, we're challenged, and we need to grieve. A good life is a life that suffers well. I know some things about suffering, both professionally, in terms of the effort I've made to help people understand the losses they carry and the grief that needs to be expressed, but I also know it personally. Some of you know, probably many of you don't know, because many of you probably don't even know me, but 5 years ago, my wife and my family suffered a devastating loss. My youngest son passed away post-surgery. While no surgery is without risk, this was supposed to be a surgery where he had surgery in the morning and he was home in the afternoon eating his favorite meal and watching his favorite television show. He was 22 years old when he passed away. His adoptive name is Zachariah. His story is both heartbreaking and it's life-giving. We were a foster family for about 10 years, a little over 10 years. And we had 26 children come and go, and some stayed for a few weeks and some stayed for years. When Zachariah arrived, and I'll, of course, never forget that evening when I came home from work. When he arrived, he was 9 months old. And the first time I saw him, I was absolutely shocked at what I saw. He looked like a malnourished little bird. He made no sounds, and it looked like living or dying was yet to be decided. He was considered a failure to thrive baby. In layman terms, that means he had basically given up. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, he was shutting down. He had suffered prior to arriving in our home. He had suffered physical and emotional trauma. He was literally dying in a playpen when the police found him. As a result of this trauma, he had all kinds of challenges. His initial prognosis was he would probably never walk or be able to speak. He was blind in one eye and had significant visual impairment in the other. There were significant intellectual delays. He had mild cerebral palsy, facial paralysis, and a condition called microcephalia, which is a neurodevelopmental disorder that affected his cognitive functioning. He had obviously come into a world that abused and neglected him. His faith was crushed. Our intention, like with all the other children, was to care for him and prepare him for what we hope would be an adoptive family. But God had a different plan. Marshall knew before I did, that Marshall, my wife, that he was to become a permanent part of our family. The day we adopted him, his name became Zachariah, a gift from God. We had 22 wonderful years, heartbreaking, challenging, joyful years with him. There are so many wonderful memories. Zachariah was had a lifelong fear of babies. He was afraid of babies when he was 5 years old, and he was afraid of babies when he was 22 years old. I want to share a story with you from Zachariah's story. His fear of babies first came to our attention when he was about 5 years old. He was playing in one of the indoor areas at a local fast food restaurant. He had entered a tunnel and was at the halfway point between two entrances. We were able to watch all of this because the tunnel was off the ground and made out of see-through plexiglass. As he reached the middle of the point of the tunnel, two babies entered, one from each end. We watched as he saw these flesh-eating babies crawl toward him. At first, he just froze, hoping they would not see him and maybe turn back towards the entrance. Once he realized this was not going to happen, he curled up and began to cry. All three sets of parents got involved as we strategized how to stop these flesh-eating babies from consuming Zachariah. When he got like this, there was no talking him through it. We tried to coach him out of the tunnel, but he wouldn't have no part of it. I suppose from his perspective, we didn't understand the life and death moment that he was in. These babies were not backing up, so it required one brave parent to go in and rescue him. I knew that the fatherly thing to do was go in with no concern for my own personal safety. I decided to go in toward the baby that looked the least vicious. As I crawled past this 9-month-old who was smiling and cooing, in Zachariah's world, that was a ploy to make you think you were safe, I slowly crawled back towards the entrance while shielding Zachariah from harm. I am sure he thought we would never make it out and his mom would have to drive him home alone. It's a wonderful memory that I have about my son, and there's so many. He gave back. I hope you're laughing. I have no idea if you're laughing because I can't see you. We should have done a laugh track on this thing so I could hear laughter right now. And I'll just have to imagine you laughing, I guess. He gave back much more than we gave to him. I now know that he came to us not only to be loved and protected, but he came to help us heal what was broken in our lives. The day Zachariah passed away was the most difficult day of my life. I had talked the talk for many years. I questioned if I could walk the walk. I needed to make room for the unwanted. One of the books that provided so much comfort to me during the early days and months of Zachariah's passing was a wonderful book called A Grace Disguised by Jerry Stitzer. Maybe some of you may know of it. He lost 3 generations of his family in a head-on car accident, a drunk driver hitting head-on. He lost his mother, he lost his wife and one of his children, and the other 2 children were pretty seriously injured. I'm going to read a quote from him. I discovered in that moment that I had the power to choose the direction my life would head, even if the only choice open to me, at least initially, was either to run from the loss or face it as best I could. Since I knew the darkness was inevitable and unavoidable, I decided from that point on to walk into the darkness rather than try to outrun it. To let my experience of loss take me on a journey wherever it would lead, and to allow myself to be transformed by my suffering. I chose to turn toward the pain and yield to the loss. End of quote. You know, my grief, my suffering has taught me so much, so many things. I instinctively knew when Zachariah passed away that one of 2 things would rise up out of my pain. Either a faith in something that seeks to deny my loss, therefore separating me from myself, or a faith that carries me back to my value. Simone Weil, a French philosopher and Christian mystic, was right when she wrote, "There are only 2 things that pierce the human heart, beauty and affliction, moments that we wish would last forever and moments we wish had never begun." There are so many moments, beautiful moments, filled with joy and laughter, and moments of sadness and fear. He had multiple surgeries. I watched as people stared at him because of his difficulty with speech and his difficulty with social interaction. There was joy watching him hit a softball in Special Olympics, watching him come up out of the water when Chad Lewis baptized him, and the entire church sang. My grief has taught me that we cannot possess what we love. I tried and I failed. My effort to do so came from a place of fear that separates me from the sacred. The effort is a saboteur of the present because it focuses on guaranteeing of a tomorrow. When Zachariah passed away, I was a very broken man in need of restoration. My heart was exposed. I was vulnerable. I desperately needed God to fill my heart with mercy and grace. You know, I think the truth is that we are all broken, and we all are in need of mercy and grace. I have learned that loss, devastating loss, any kind of loss really, is not to be conquered. It is something we must learn to live with if we're going to suffer well and if we're going to live well. We must create a space for our pain and invite God to bring comfort and love and transformation into our lives. Today, 5 years later, my grief continues, but it is evolving. Now, I look back on those first few months of my son's passing with a strange sense of gratitude in the midst of gut-wrenching pain, so disruptive that I questioned my ability to survive. I heard a voice calling me from within, calling me to believe. I continue to be comforted through a belief transcending what I really can understand, calling me to deeper water. It is that place I encounter a presence that can only be understood as the divine. I think it's important that we all understand the value of our pain. Pain serves as a vehicle for healing and liberation. In the experience of our brokenness, we can walk to the end of ourselves and lean into a space where we surrender and experience the sweet intimacy of a loving God. We're all sojourners. We're a community of believers. I pray that we'll grow in our love for one another. Love requires us to hold each other's stories, and where we find suffering, to come along beside and point to the grace of a loving God. A quote from The Relational Soul: "So a healthy community teaches us how to hold suffering in innumerable ways. We bear one another's burdens. We share in the fellowship of suffering. We participate in this life of death and dying. This is done again and again and again. It marks us. It distinguishes us as God's people. As the community teaches us, we are then available for comfort for those who have affliction." End of quote. When we love, we expose ourselves. When we love deeply, we expose the kind of vulnerability that puts us at risk to suffer greatly. It takes courage to love, and it takes courage to suffer well. We're all suffering. Our world has been painfully disrupted. We all need to grieve. Let's open our hearts to our grief. Let's do life together. I love the idea, the belief that we are all simply walking each other home. So let's cry together. Let's laugh together. And let's struggle together, because we will struggle. I pray that we find the courage to move towards humility as a community, towards vulnerability and authenticity. I miss you all. I miss our collective voices singing on Sunday morning. I miss the worship. I miss you. I hope you miss me. If you don't miss me, I hope you pretend that you do miss me when I see you again. God bless you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I miss you, Fred.
Miss you too, brother.
Yeah. Gee, thanks so much for sharing that. I wanted to mention to everybody, I wanted to shamelessly sell this book, Zechariah's Story. I don't know if you can see it, but it's the story that Fred wrote a few years ago out of his grief. And it is a wonderful story. You can get it on Amazon, I believe, right, Fred?
Yes. Yes.
And my wife and I read it together. We wept together. We laughed together. And it helped me to understand you better, but also I think people who have gone through similar kinds of things as well. And it also helped, it led me to think about the beauty of having a child who's mentally impaired growing up before you, with you, and how much he became such a part of you and Marcelle's souls. And I thought a lot about that because that was something that was so touching about it. Some of the stories that I most enjoyed were the role playing that you did with Zach. What would you tell us just a little bit about the things that he enjoyed doing, and you with him, right?
Yeah, Zachariah was developmentally delayed, and when he was 20, developmentally he was probably about 10. So he was kind of stuck in time, and he had this incredible, and a lot of special needs kids are this way. He had this incredible innocence about him, and every day was a new day. And he was totally obsessed with police officers and soldiers. And so every day he would either be dressed as a police officer or as a soldier. And he had an array of Nerf guns and all the play weapons I guess a kid could acquire. And every Saturday morning I would get up to a note, and his writing was often difficult to decipher, but it would say Army or police, and it would have boxes by it. And I was supposed to check the box that I wanted to play for that day. And at the bottom of the note, true feelings, please. Just simple, precious things like that he kept me young. Yeah, I miss him so much.
You started your talking about your journey as a therapist for many, many years, helping other people with their losses, right? How did the loss of Zach affect your therapy?
The morning that he passed away, I cried out to a room full of people. Zach passed away at our home. That I wondered if I could work again. I wondered if I could laugh again. I wondered if my marriage would survive this kind of loss. And I'm just so grateful to say that I am laughing again, and my marriage has went to a deeper, more meaningful place. And I think my works went to a deeper, more meaningful place. I think my compassion and my empathy has multiplied as a result of the amount of loss that I've suffered. And I'm just convinced that we're all broken and in need of God's grace, and in need of sometimes permission to grieve.
I think I began to get to know you maybe 3 years ago, and that might have been then just a couple years after you lost Zach. What I became aware of quickly was the theme that it's important for us to press into our pain. And I hadn't heard anybody ever say it like that, put it that way. What do you mean when you talk like that? And what do you think the goal of life is in relation to our pain?
I think that when pain is not validated and pain is not acknowledged, we separate from ourselves, and we live a life that's that at times is not much more than survival, and we separate from our authenticity. And I think leaning back into our pain is leaning back into that need, that comfort, that healing that never occurred. And it's never too late for that to occur. It takes courage to do that because there tends to be so much shame wrapped around the pain. But reducing the shame and really coming into the grief and experiencing the life-giving grief that exists there. And it's liberating, I believe. It's healing. We can begin to become intimate with our own stories. And I think God meets us there in a very powerful way. and I think transforms our life. And we are then able to experience a much more deeper love from God than we've ever been able to, because of the shame we've carried, the hiding of our wound, the hiding of our pain.
Thank you, Fred. You have been a help to me in these last 3 years, and I'm so glad that you could join us tonight and share some of your story and your wisdom with us. I'm reminded that I've also gotten to know you because you and I have co-led the lay counseling team and helped to train them over the last few years, and that's been a joy of mine.
Yes.
And to be able to see you in that context has been wonderful. So
Yes.
thank you for being here. And
Thank you.
I want to turn next to the last panelist that we haven't heard from yet, and her name is Briahna Michalsky, and actually we got to meet her, Fred and I, in one of the lay counseling classes that we taught. Briahna is a clinical social worker herself and is working in the field, and she has her own story of grief. And would you take a couple of minutes to open that up for us, Briahna?
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you, Fred, for sharing. My name is Briahna Michalsky, and I got to know Eric through the lay counseling program at Sojourn. My own story of loss honestly began when I was growing up in a conservative Christian home. Everything seemed okay until I came home from college my junior year, and in a seemingly sudden decision of my parents to separate and subsequently divorce led to a whole lot of chaos in my own life and in that of my family's life. Looking back, I can see warning signs, but during that time period, there really was no warning. They had waited to tell me until I came to home on spring break because they wanted me to support my younger siblings, as they told us. Although that is a common story of loss, it can affect us all in different ways. Loss often disrupts the scaffolding around which we build our lives. And in that particular type of loss, for example, the church that I had been a part of became a casualty. They were so conservative that there was a whole lot of shame even for me to continue attending. There was shame for either one of my parents to attend. So, in a brief description of my own dealings with loss, I just want to share with anyone else going through a similar situation. You may not know the impact, you may not know the full impact, but you can sense the chaos. And I agree with James and Terra in the slowing down and allowing yourself to process the impact and kind of the outworking of certain scaffoldings around which you've built your life. Those being torn down, and hopefully through faith eventually and through community, being rebuilt into something different that you may not have ever expected. So.
Thanks, Briahna. You are touching on a theme that's been addressed by a number of times this evening, and that's one of the hardest issues that I think we deal with in the church when we talk about grief, because we have God and God's got all the answers, and so we're supposed to have all the answers, and grief is supposed to come easily, or maybe we don't need to grieve so much because after all, God's in control of all of this. And so maybe we could begin just right there. How is it that as Christians we find a healthy way to grieve that isn't that isn't avoidant of grief and doesn't super spiritualize it? Anybody want to jump into that?
I'll chime in here because of how I was talking about just how differently we grieve. There was one of the things that I noticed after everything started getting shut down for COVID. I noticed this just ongoing frustration / anxiety building in me on day to day. And I just kept assuming that, well, of course I have anxiety. This makes sense. Everybody's feeling this way right now, which to some degree is probably accurate, right? Or maybe it's because all my kids are at home now and I'm overwhelmed because I went from having one child at home half the week and now all 5 of them are at home all the time, and so I just kept kind of excusing it, I guess, like feeling like that there's a logical reason for this and that there was a logical reason for it. But what I didn't realize was a lot of the logical reason was the loss that was coming from the underside, and that's not what I was noticing. On the surface level, I just thought that I was getting more anxious because of the practicality, because of everything's harder now and like physically harder, or that I'm needed more now, and all those things are true. But what I wasn't noticing was I wasn't acknowledging how many things I felt like I had lost in the midst of it. And I think part of that is because really in the grand scheme of things, our family has been very fortunate and we haven't lost a lot of the really big things that a lot of people have. And so I was feeling a lot of guilt and judgment towards myself for feeling any grief, because I was kind of telling myself I should be okay with this. I still have all my basic needs met. I still have above my basic needs met right now. I shouldn't be upset about this. But that was a really big realization for me, even just acknowledging and noticing how many things I was really sad about. And then it hit me like a ton of bricks. And there were about 3 days in a row where I almost couldn't control my emotions without like having to get up out of them and physically move my body, get up and do something. And then I broke my foot, so then I couldn't physically move my body and I had to figure out something else. And fortunately, I'm married to him and he helps with that too. But I don't know, just mentioning my personal experience with that is I just wasn't really super keenly aware to it. I just kept excusing it away. And then when I noticed it come up, it was really a lot for me to handle for a few days. And I had to really tap onto that judgment thing, like I said, because I just tend to be so prone to judge what I'm feeling, or it's not bad enough, or it's not whatever enough. I shouldn't feel this way, which really isn't helping anything in this situation, because grief is grief, regardless of what it is or how strongly it is. It was still something going on here, and judging it's not doing anything to get it out of my body or out of my emotions or giving it to the Lord in any form or fashion. So, yeah.
Thanks, Terra. One of the challenges that you're pointing to is awareness, right? Because we can be grieving and not know it. And we've heard that a few times this evening, but that's a real important reminder. I think especially when there's so much distracting us right now and so much newness, it's easy to ignore that underlying loss that we're all experiencing. One of the questions that's been asked, and I hope people are beginning to type in questions to the Q&A portion of your screen, is about unusual, out of the ordinary kinds of losses that we can experience. One that was mentioned was, for example, when a family member develops mental illness, for example, and the hopes and dreams that family members had that the person, him or herself had, are changed. And there's a kind of a loss there. Another kind that was mentioned is the experience of family estrangement. Nobody expects that their family is going to break down or that members won't talk to each other. We all hope we're going to have a great family for our whole lives, but things can change that. And those can bring out kinds of losses and kinds of grief that are shocking at first, maybe, but require or deserve attending to. I wonder if any of you panelists have any thoughts about those kinds of sort of out of what most people think is typical sources of grief or loss.
Eric, if I could answer that, I think we often have this list, intellectual list of the things that are acceptable to grieve. And the list tends to be very, very limited because life is hard and there are many, many things in life to grieve. And I think whether we grieve or not and how we grieve has a lot to do with whether we're traveling with permission to grieve. And so many of us, I think, rolled into our adult lives without that permission. And I think that's the work of understanding our stories and unpacking our stories and look for what's there in terms of permission to feel. And because it's really about being honest about what our experience is. And the things that you've mentioned, those are hard. And there's loss associated with that. But if we've got this list and anything outside that list can't be grieved, then we're gonna be living with a lot of judgment and a lot of restraint in being able to live with courage and openness in what we bring forward to our community and what we bring forward to God. And at the end, that's a tragedy. And I think at the end, that's often going to result in some sort of crash and burn down the road because that can have a short shelf life. Probably the shorter the better.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else have any experience with a non-traditional, shall we say, kinds of grief?
I would just want to add a clarifying statement to something that Fred said. What was going on in my head as he was speaking was that it can be an internal inhibition to grieve, but also an external. And I think being able to find that community, being able to find a good therapist or find someone to walk alongside us is imperative in order to process and truly understand what areas of our life those particular kinds of grief are affecting.
Yeah, thank you.
You know, Eric, I think a common thing that I tend to when I'm, navigating or coming alongside of people, it's like giving them permission to say it's okay not to feel okay. It is. It's really interesting when you can give somebody the words like it's okay not to feel okay, and for them to receive it, and you can see it in their face because it's such a shock that it should be something different. And so I think that that word of permission and maybe even hearing it from a safe other is just enough that we need to be able to grieve.
Yeah. Folks struggle with the role of God in these kinds of events as well. We've talked about how God can be a comfort, but we all believe that in some way God allows things to happen to us that can be really hard and sometimes cascade upon us in multiples. How do we address that as Christians?
One of the hardest questions that I ever fielded, Eric, is always the why question. And I can remember a woman in New Salisbury, Indiana, was my first visit as a hospice chaplain, where I was confronted by the mother. And these were her words that, I remember I think it was a Wednesday morning, chaplain, why would God take my third child from me? And this was like just days before Mother's Day. The first was taken by, I think a car accident. And I think the second was a drug overdose. And the third was dying of lung cancer. And I mean, it was like one of those where like I literally had to take a deep breath and was doing a lot of prayers internally because you could tell from this mother that she really wanted an answer. And, I looked at this mom and I said, I am so sorry that this is your third child who's dying. And I know that there is no answer that I could give that is satisfactory. But I looked her in the eye, and I believe this was the Holy Spirit, the Lord, giving me these words, but I shared to her, I want you to know that you are not the first person to ask the why question. That 2,000 years ago, Jesus asked the why question. My God, why did you forsake me? And I went on to just say, you know, I think all the whys that you're asking, even in your heart right now, and I think all the whys that this world is asking, I think in some ways is caught up in Jesus's why. And I think I also said, I want you to know that you're not alone in your why, that Jesus identifies with you. And little did I know that she even had a spiritual background, and she started sharing about her faith. But I think if there's anything that I'm learning in scripture when dealing with grief, I think at the heart of where people are at in their grief, I think they desire to be known, that if you'll be with me in it. I don't think that they want even particularly like clear answers. I think at the core, it's, will you be with me in my grief? I think, which is beautiful about God, because I think time after time where his people were in trouble, he always promised them his presence, being with them, right? Jesus being Emmanuel, God with us. I think there's something about knowing that God is with us in the midst of that, that not say it, you know, totally solves, you know, the grief or the issue, but there's something about in the safety of presence and identification and empathy that something loosens in people's souls. You know, that's kind of my roundabout answer of getting at, you know, these tough questions about grief.
Yeah, thanks, James. That's those are the hardest questions to deal with as friends. Someone has written in that that they have a dear friend who's dying, and I won't go into all the details, but they want to be a comforter, and yet they can't go over and even hug the person at this time, and this pandemic presents unusual challenges for providing comfort for others. Fred, what kinds of things can we say to others through the phone? What other alternatives are there when we can't go over and be there present?
Yeah, I mean, pragmatically, I think that staying in contact through the phone, staying in contact through Zoom, depending on the level of comfort, going over and keeping a social distance, working, trying to find ways to, none of these answers, of course, like you said, Eric, are easy in the world we live in today, but to try to find a way to stay present, because staying present is just a vital part of coming alongside somebody who is in need, somebody who is grieving. When my son passed away, it seldom had much to do with the words that they said, but it had a whole lot to do with their presence and just showing up. That it's life-giving, and it's just so important. But yeah, we're challenged in terms of how we do that today.
We haven't talked about is it possible to do wrong in our grief? Is it, are there limits to what is appropriate in our grieving? Can we sin and grieve? How do we handle that? Briahna, you want to tackle that one?
I'll do my best. I mean, grief is an emotion. It's a state of being that we experience as humans, just like many other emotions in which we may find ourselves. Grief does look different for different people, but I mean, I believe there are limitations in the sense of we're still responsible for our choices and our actions in our grief. I think that's where it can get a little cloudy in a lot of conservative circles? What if your grief is too heavy that you're not, quote unquote, taking care of the home as well as you should? Or what if you sink into, a complex grief that leads into a depressive season, and that leads to maybe not doing your job as well as you would think you should or you need to in order to have a good moral standard. But to have the permission to give yourself a wider margin and have community around you can help protect against some of those issues. I don't really know beyond that. I mean, we're still all responsible for our choices. But I know grace abounds. Eric.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great. What do we do though when we get angry with God? That's not uncommon. James, Terra?
That's, well, one thing is that God is not surprised when that is an emotion in us, right? And in some ways, I don't know, I mean, in my kind of reading and reflections of the Psalms, like imprecatory Psalms are, I don't know, I mean, I think there is some anger that rises within those words. I mean, we read them, but I mean, if you really take in what's being said, there is an emotion of anger, right? And so I don't know, I mean, one of the things that in helping people is, again, naming that before God. Because I think I think God is gracious when these, I've heard it said, these pre-reflective outbursts, right? I think he wants us to be honest. I think it's going back to the question that he first posed, with Adam and Eve, where are you? And I don't know, I think there is gracious space to be able to say, God, I'm angry at you. And he holds it, right? Now, again, I think, we want to transition and help through that, but I think there's a way of still validating that in a way that's human and that's safe. So those are my words.
Yeah, in addition to that, I remember somebody told me one time when I was expressing kind of that thought, they said, God is big enough to handle your anger. And it was such a simple statement, but that has stuck with me for probably the past 20 years since I first heard that, because it was like there was a fear within me. What if I'm too angry for God? Or what if I'm too much? And it's like, it sounds kind of ridiculous saying that out loud. But I think sometimes we feel that because we're afraid, we've got to present ourselves to the Lord a certain way, but God knows what's in our heart anyway. So it's not like we're keeping anything from him by not expressing it to him. I mean, that's my personal view on that. So it's like, if we're feeling it, of all the people, we can bring it to him because he is big enough to handle it. And if we don't express that with him, chances are it's going to come out sideways with our spouses or our kids or our friends or our coworkers. It's going to come out somewhere. So how about I give it to the person, to the being, to God who can handle it, versus trying to, pretend it's not there when it really is, and then it spills out on my family and everybody around me.
Thank you. That's so helpful. This whole situation is pressing upon us, and these kinds of struggles that we're living in and that are sometimes unique to us as individuals bring out the reality of our souls. And part of what I think we're doing in these series of webinars is acknowledging the reality of our souls. And I'm pretty messed up, and in my grief, I sometimes sin against God, and that's a part of the reality of my soul. But just as you said there, that's what we bring to the Lord, and we say, God, I'm a mess, but help me. And who better to go to in the midst of all of that? One of most sobering questions that we've gotten tonight is about suicide. That's a difficulty that many of us have been exposed to, experienced indirectly, family members or friends. What do we do when someone close to us? How do we deal with that ourselves, and in helping survivors of suicide? Fred, I suspect that's happened in your career. What do you say to survivors of suicide?
Meaning survivors of loved ones who have committed suicide.
Friends, right. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's what I meant. Thank you.
It so often comes with a guilt and a feeling of responsibility for not having been able to stop the person from ending their life. And it's difficult to get to the grief until you've been able to address the guilt, the false guilt, the responsibility that most often is not warranted, and to help them come to understand the powerlessness that's there over somebody else's life, and then to step into the sadness, step into the fear, the anger, allow those feelings to move forward in their life as part of their healing.
Thank you. Well, the last question that was given to us, I'd like to end with this one, has to do with the title. Why does it say grief and loss and a gradual resurrection? I have an idea, but I wonder what you panelists could say to that.
I have not yet found a switch to flip in terms of my healing. That most of what we do in life, most of what we talk about relationally, is about a process. And I have this, for some time, I've had this mantra that none of us get cured, but we get better if we walk in the right direction. And I think God blesses us when we move in the right direction. And I think that's good enough. I know I'm not there yet.
Well, going back to that passage of scripture, Eric, that I, went to in John 20, right? Here's Jesus, the resurrected Savior, right? Didn't rush Mary to cheer up, right? He still acknowledged her tears. So even the resurrected Jesus was able to hold space for sadness. There is not this instant resurrection. I think the resurrection holds, people still in their sadness, in their sadness. And so I don't know. I mean, I think it is. It's not a light switch. It's not like we get over grief. I think grief becomes part of the fabric of our life. It's part of our story. And I think God wants all of our stories, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because it's us. That's who we are. So no, I think there's something to that title, Eric, as we discussed it this past week, that it's a gradual resurrection here in this time and space.
Briahna, you want to respond to that?
Sure. My thoughts immediately go to most of David's Psalms, in just his wrestling, why are you downcast, O my soul? And most of the Psalms have a movement to reflection and remembrance of what God has worked in the past, which doesn't solve, doesn't fix what's going on in the present. But it does help David process through that growth and that progression towards a small redemption here in the present. I think in most of our lives, we're always waiting for something. One of the hardest things to wait for is healing. And so that waiting for redemption, that waiting for the resurrection, either of laughter again, like Fred mentioned, resurrection of hope. I think the pieces can start to fall into place as we sit with ourselves and sit with our faith.
Thank you. there is a sense in which our losses and our grieving is a participation in Christ's suffering. We're united to him in that. And so I appreciate the different ways you all emphasize how God raises us from the deadness of our experience in this fallen world and allows us to participate in his resurrection as he lifts us and restores us slowly but surely. Thank you for that. You know, I think we have time for one more question. Somebody's asking about the classic stages of grief. Do you think there are those stages and you're working with people? What does that look like? I suspect James has given a lot of thought to that. You want to tackle that one?
Sure. You know, as I think it was asked, linear or, stages. I think the stages are helpful. Sadly, I think it's definitely been taken as more of this linear approach, but I know that it's definitely more, I like how Fred, grief is ever evolving, it's more fluid. And because I think, when you think of denial, anger, depression, bargaining, acceptance, and I know even David Kessler had to add another sixth stage, and that is meaning, because as he's even explored with others about grief work, that acceptance doesn't even feel enough, right? That this idea of even finding meaning after after a loss or a death is even added. So he actually just came out a book with that. So I think that the categories are helpful, but it shouldn't be taken linearly. I think it's good markers to kind of help us where we're at. But at the end of the day, I think it's limited, given its kind of understanding. I think our Christian worldview definitely takes it up to a whole different idea in terms of flourishing and really what we're talking about, resurrection, right? So those are some of my thoughts. I could answer a little bit more, but those are kind of what's kind of in my mind right now.
Yeah, I want to ask one last question that just popped up. Because it's a really important one. Can you give some suggestions for someone in grief and depression that feel unable to be positive most of the time and then isolate themselves because people find it difficult to be around you? We don't have much time, but could somebody respond to that? Fred?
Wow. Well, that's a difficult question to answer in a few words. I think about the courage to be transparent. I think about the vulnerability. I think about showing up when you don't really feel like showing up. Find the courage just to put one foot in front of the other and be there. And you may not get much dividend out of your experience initially, but if you'll just keep putting one foot in front of the other. I often talk to people who are going through divorce, difficulties in their lives. Just brush your teeth, put food in your mouth, call somebody, just do whatever you can to slowly walk from where you are. Yeah, that's my thought.
Thank you. Thanks, Fred. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. We hope that this time together was beneficial. I sure found it to be helpful to hear from my friends. Remember that this event will be published on Sojourn East website, YouTube channel, I should say, by Wednesday, if not sooner. And please take a few minutes to complete the survey before you log out this evening. It really helps us to improve in the quality. We want to do better and better every time we come out together. We also want to thank the panelists for joining us. What a wonderful group of people you are. Thank you so much for that. And any who were touched by tonight and feel that you have some work to do, you want some help to do it, please go to our COVID webpage or the Sojourn East Care webpage and sign up. to talk with an elder. We have some wonderful elders that would like to meet with you, talk with you. We have a lay counseling program that have some trained lay people that would meet for an extended period of time with you. We want to be available, especially now, but we want to increasingly be the kind of church that takes these things seriously and is a friend to one another. Thanks to all of you. Take care. We'll see you when we're able to.